Good morning. Welcome to Nonce Disrespecting Adversaries, Practical Forgery Attacks on GCM and TLS in the South Seas IJ room with speakers Sean Devlin, Hanno Burke, and Aaron Zellner. Before we begin, a few brief notes. Stop by the business hall located in Bayside AB during the day and for the welcome reception from 5:30 to 7 o'clock tonight. The Black Hat Arsenal is on the Palm Foyer on level 3. Join us for a Pony Awards in Mandalay Bay BCD at 6:30 p.m. Thanks for putting your phone on vibrate. It makes it easier for the rest of us to ignore the ringing while you wait for your voicemail to pick it up. With that, we thank you and welcome our speakers.
Hi guys, I'm Sean.
I'm Hanno.
So to get started, I'm going to load up our slide deck. I don't have it with me, unfortunately, but I have a pretty good idea about how we can actually get it here so we can get started. I gotta say, there's about a 20% chance this will work, so. Oh, okay, it worked. Okay, yeah. Great. So what actually happened there is we targeted a vulnerable domain and actually injected our entire slide deck into it, and we're just going to run the talk this way. So. So with that, I'll turn it over to Hannah.
Can you make full screen? Yeah. Okay, so we want to talk about TLS encryption and especially the symmetric part of TLS encryption. So very roughly how the TLS protocol works is that first we have some kind of key exchange, and then we get a shared key between the client and the server, and then we use some symmetric encryption and authentication, and this second part is the one we want to look at today. There were historically three ways to do this symmetric encryption. One is using the CBC mode in combination with HMAC, one is RC4, and one is GCM. And there's a new one, CHA-20 and Poly 1305, but this has only been standardized a couple of weeks ago, so that's not widely available yet. The CBC-based modes had a number of attacks in the past years. There was already in 2002 the first version of a padding oracle, and then many more attacks that were similar. This is going on until this year. We had new attacks on these modes. And there were basically two design problems in these CBC modes. One is that they are using a so-called implicit initialization vector, which has been changed in TLS 1.1, but for a long time, most people didn't use TLS 1.1. Then in the very old SSL version 3, the content of the padding was undefined, which enabled the poodle attack. And all TLS versions use something that's called MAC then encrypt, or more precisely MAC then pad and encrypt. And this allowed attacks because if an attacker can detect whether the padding is wrong or whether the MAC is wrong, that allows him to decrypt parts of the content. And there's an extension to change that to encrypt then MAC, but that's not really used in the wild. I like to show this quote from the TLS 1.2 standard because it already kind of predicts the attacks that later happened. So it says this leaves a small timing side channel, but it is not believed to be large enough to be exploitable. And it turned out it was exploitable. That was the Lucky 13 attack, which really was a kind of a big mess. So there was last year an attack where the Amazon had their own TLS implementation, and they tried to fix this, and it turned out the fix didn't really work. And there are a number of implementations who just say, we won't fix this because the fix is so bothersome, we'll just ignore it and try to move to the newer cipher modes. And OpenSSL, which was one of our co-authors who found this, Juraj Somorovsky, that with the fix for Lucky 13, OpenSSL introduced another padding oracle. So these whole CBC modes, while you can implement them in a secure way, it's very difficult, and therefore we kind of want to get rid of them. And then there's one alternative, RC4, where like after Lucky 13, a lot of people switched to RC4, but this has weaknesses as well. So RC4 is a stream cipher, and the problem there is that it has certain biases, that for certain parts of the key stream, it's more likely that it's a 1 than a 0. And this can be attacked. It has been known for a long time, but in 2013, there was the first practical attack on RC4 in TLS, and since then there have been many improvements of these attacks. So RC4 also isn't a good alternative, and there's also now an RFC saying that you should just never use RC4 anymore. So this leaves us with GCM. GCM stands for Galois counter mode and is usually used with AES. It is theoretically possible to use it with other ciphers, but basically nobody does that. And it's only available in TLS 1.2, which turned out to be like, when these attacks were found, a lot of software didn't support TLS 1.2 yet. But it's generally, I think, a consensus today in the cryptographic community that this is the only mode that's really safe. And here's a quote from Adam Langley from Google, where he clearly states that like all the other modes are kind of cryptographically broken. So yeah, we thought we should have a closer look at GCM, because if everyone's moving to GCM, so how secure is that? So GCM is an authenticated encryption mode, which the basic idea behind that is that there were a lot of vulnerabilities when people tried to combine encryption and authentication. So the idea is to have one mode that does just both things combined, standardized, and that's called an authenticated encryption mode, or more precisely, authenticated encryption with additional data. But it turns out GCM is not very popular among cryptographers. So I have a number of quotes here where Niels Ferguson commented on the GCM standard: do not use GCM, consider using one of the other modes. Then there was a paper from Emilia Kesper and Peter Schwabe, they wrote a timing safe implementation of GCM and concluded that most other implementations are not timing safe. Adam Langley says that yeah, it so easily leads to timing side channels. He doesn't want to use it. Yeah, bottom line is everybody uses GCM, but it seems nobody really likes it. Yeah. So, and I wondered why that's the case, and then I found this quote also from Adam Langley, where he specifically commented on GCM in TLS, where he says that there's a potential problem with the so-called nonce value. So he said there's an 8-byte value that basically the implementation has to change and to choose, and the only safe way to do that is to use a counter. And there may be implementations that choose this at random or do something else that may not be secure. And Adam Langley scanned the Alexa top 200,000 and didn't find any implementations doing that. So what we did then is we scanned the whole internet for this. Yeah. So what's the issue here? So GCM needs a nonce value, which stands for number used once, and that is a requirement for the security of the algorithm. So if one uses the same nonce value twice, then it's no longer a nonce, and then you have attacks. And the nonce value in TLS is 8 bytes large, and as said earlier, it's safe to use a counter. So you could just say we use a 0, and for the next encryption we use a 1 and a 2, and so on. If you use a random value, then it's not so clear whether that's secure. So of course, if it's random, it can randomly generate the same value again. If you try to calculate how likely that is, then you need several gigabytes of data or even terabytes of data till this becomes an issue. But even though it's not ideal, like you don't want this risk even for connections using several gigabytes. So we ended up saying, okay, if the nonce value gets just repeated, that's clearly a security vulnerability. If the nonce value is chosen at random, we say, okay, that's still kind of a low-risk security vulnerability. And this is what the TLS specification says about this nonce value. So it tells the implementer of the TLS library each value of the nonce must be distinct for each invocation of the encryption. But it doesn't really tell how to do that. So what I just told you, that just use a counter and that's secure, that's not written down in the spec. And it's not written down that a random value may be risky. It says, however, that you may use the sequence number from the TLS record, which is a reasonable recommendation, and it's kind of unclear why they didn't say this is simply a must, because then these issues wouldn't happen. And then you could just skip sending the nonce because the TLS record number, the implementation already knows. So yeah, so we scanned the internet for this issue. We wrote a little patch to OpenSSL that it would print the nonce value of a connection, and we found a bit less than 200 hosts that had a repeating nonce just by doing 10 connections, and we found around 70,000 hosts with a random nonce. And yeah, then the next job was trying to track down which devices are responsible for this. So we had a bunch of information that we could look at. We had the certificate information, we had the website, and we could look at the HTTP server header. A problem with that is that quite often you see a server header, but it's not really the device you're talking to, because there may be a server and there's a load balancer in front of it, and the load balancer is doing the TLS termination, and you have no way of knowing which kind of device that is. And trying to contact people saying, hey, your website has a security issue, that by experience hardly works. So people just don't answer emails if you tell them about security issues. So what we ended up doing is trying to find like vulnerable hosts where we kind of knew someone who may know someone at this company, and thereby we were able to track down a few of them. So then for the random looking values, a lot of them seem to come from Checkpoint based on their server header, but it turns out these values were not really random. So Checkpoint then told us that they are using a linear feed break shift register, which also goes through the whole space of the 64-bit nonce, so it's equally secure as a counter. But this was a bit surprising, and it was also, then we had to adapt our scanning tools that they would like not, they would filter out these LFSR values. Then for the duplicate nonces that are the severe security vulnerability, we were able to identify two vendors. One were devices from Radware, which use a chip from Cavium. And they have received an update now. And there are several pages from Visa Europe. Visa didn't answer our initial emails, but then Ars Technica wrote about it, and then they contacted us. But we have not disclosed the vendor yet because we're still kind of in the process with them for the disclosure process. Yeah, and the devices with random nonces, a lot of them came from A10, and some of them were IBM Lotus Domino, and both vendors published updates. So if you have one of these, you probably want to install an update. And also a lot of them came from a company called Sangfor. It's from China, and they seem to produce like cheap DSL routers and things like that, but we got no response from them. But based on the data we see, we're pretty convinced that there are more devices out there that have this vulnerability. So we recommend if you're doing testing of TLS devices, or if you're a pen tester, that you kind of have this on your radar and look out for this. And this was something that I spent a bit of time trying to understand what's going on here. This was seen with the Radware device, but also with another device where I had a phone call with the owners of this device and they told me a vendor name, but I wasn't really sure if that was a reliable information. And we're seeing here that there are two values and they look like uninitialized memory. And I got the information that this may be an OpenSSL 101J. And I looked into that code and found, okay, well, so what OpenSSL does is it uses a counter, but it starts with a random value. And this code here is not checking whether the random number generator is failing. So what I assume that's happening here is that they use maybe some kind of hardware random number generator that sometimes produces failures and then returns an error, and OpenSSL is not properly checking for this. This has been fixed earlier last year, but OpenSSL back then did not consider it as a security issue. And if I change this code to return this error, then I could see a similar behavior, but not the same behavior. I saw it sending out these two identical nonces, which looked very similar to the values we had on the slide before, but then the connection terminated due to some kind of error. So it's not entirely sure what's going on there, but there we kind of tried to track down why that was the case. Okay, and now I turn over to Sean for the attack description.
Yeah, so we've been hearing a lot about GCM, how it requires a unique nonce for safe usage. So we're going to dig a little bit into why that is. So during the NIST standardization process of GCM, they requested comments from a bunch of different cryptographers. We saw some comments from Niels Ferguson earlier, basically saying don't use GCM. Another set of comments came from Antoine Jus. And he basically showed how, in the case of nonce reuse under GCM, it's a catastrophic failure that allows the attacker to forge messages arbitrarily. And since the encryption component of GCM is, just a stream cipher mode, essentially, the attacker can modify messages with high granularity. So we're going to dig into a little bit of the specifics here. So a little bit of background on GCM. As Hannah was saying earlier, GCM is a mode that's basically parametrized by a block cipher. So most people use AES. And the user's inputs to an instance of GCM is basically going to be K, this encryption key. Now, of interest to us is a derived value H. H is going to be basically the authentication subkey that is going to be used to protect messages from forgeries. Now, H is not a user input. H is a derived value that we get by basically using our encryption key to encrypt a block of zeros under the block cipher. So just keep in mind that H is going to be our target. That's what we're trying to get back. And then at the per encryption level, the user's other input is going to be this nonce. We need to remember that's a value that we want never to repeat. So GCM authentication, how does that work? Well, the high level view is basically, actually, so if you go actually look at an implementation of GCM, what you're actually going to see is a bunch of XOR operations and table lookups and stuff like that. But what's going on at the high level, conceptually, is we're going to sort of format our message as a polynomial, which I'll get into a little bit how that works in a second here. We're going to sort of mask the polynomial with a derived value from the nonce. This is basically going to be a product of our encryption key and the per encryption nonce. So the same way we got H by encrypting a block of zeros, we're going to get this mask by encrypting the nonce, essentially. So once we have this polynomial, we're going to plug in H, and then we're going to evaluate it, and the output is going to be our authentication tag. So that's kind of the the high-level view of the algorithm. The high-level attacker's view is going to take advantage of this polynomial structure. So what we're going to do is we're going to try to tweak that polynomial so we can find a polynomial that has h as a root. Then we're going to factor that polynomial, which, fortunately, we have very efficient algorithms for factoring polynomials in the domain that we're working in here. And once we factor it, we'll have the roots of the polynomial, and h is guaranteed to be one of those roots. Typically, the number of roots is going to be pretty short. It somewhat varies with message length. If you have a very long message, you could have a lot of roots. But a lot of the messages we're going to be dealing with are going to be pretty short, and so we're going to expect only to find a few most of the time. Okay, so let's get a little bit lower level here. So for concreteness, let's just consider a message that has no additional authenticated data. Recall that GCM is an AEAD mode, so you can authenticate additional data past the plain text or the ciphertext rather. So we'll consider a message that has no authenticated data and one block of ciphertext. So if we were to format that as a polynomial, as I was saying earlier, so basically our one block of ciphertext, that's going to be c sub 1 there. That's going to be the coefficient of x squared. Next to that, we have this coefficient L, and that's going to be basically just another 128-bit block that encodes the message length. So that's going to encode both the length of the ciphertext and the length of the authenticated data. And then the constant coefficient we're going to get just by that nonce-derived value that we're going to use to mask the polynomial. So recall that that's just going to be the encryption of the nonce. I got that highlighted in red there to emphasize the fact that this is a secret value, so that the attacker doesn't know what the mask is. That's going to be important in a little bit here. And so once we have this polynomial, we just plug in h. And so we have f of h equals t, and that's going to be our authentication tag. So the receiver is going to repeat the same process, compare what he gets with the tag the sender gives him, and if they match, then it's going to be an authentic message. Okay, so the attacker is going to use some algebra to kind of fiddle with this polynomial and get to a place that's a little bit more advantageous. So the attacker, can see messages on the wire. So most of the values we're going to be working with here are public. The ciphertext is public. The length of the message is going to be public, obviously. And the authentication tag is going to be public, so the attacker can pull these things off the wire. The mask is still going to be secret, but everything else we have. So we're going to take our polynomial f, and we're going to tweak it a little bit by subtracting the authentication tag. Now what that's going to give us, recall that we had f of h equals t. So our new polynomial f prime of h, since we've subtracted t, is going to be 0. So what that means is that h is going to be a root of f prime. And recall that we have efficient algorithms for finding the roots of a polynomial. Now the problem here is that the attacker doesn't know f prime. Conceptually, we know that they're, what it looks like, but we don't actually know what this mask value is. So this is where nonce reuse is going to come in. So suppose we have two different messages encrypted under the same nonce here. So I've got those listed as f sub 1 prime and f sub 2 prime. So we're going to stick with our example of one block messages. So we have one block of ciphertext there, and then the length values, and then two different authentication tags. But the key thing to recognize here is that the per encryption mask that we generate with the key and the nonce is going to be the same in both polynomials. So what we can do then is we can use these two, we can combine them together, basically subtract one from the other to eliminate that term entirely. And what we're left with is going to be this new polynomial I've called g here at the bottom. And as you can see, the mask value has been kind of erased, and now we are left with like a fully known polynomial. And since both of the polynomials we started with had h as a root, our new polynomial g also has h as a root. So now we have a fully known polynomial, and it has h as a root, and we can simply factor this to get a list of candidates for the authentication key. So the question is, how to apply this in the TLS setting? So we basically went with the model of going after content injection basically against the client side. So that's what we saw at the beginning of this talk when we basically man in the middle it ourselves to inject this slide deck into a vulnerable domain. So basically the outline for our attack is, first of all, the user is going to visit some attacker-controlled content. This might be, for example, the attacker might inject malicious content into an unauthenticated page that the user is visiting. So once the user is at that attacker-controlled content, the attacker is basically going to use JavaScript, and they're going to initiate a TLS connection with the vulnerable server and basically start polling it and monitoring the traffic that comes back. So the attacker is going to be basically watching all the encrypted TLS records that come back. They're going to collect the responses, and they're going to basically build a dictionary by nonce. So recall, as Hannah was saying, in TLS, we kind of have this 8-byte nonce that is, again, a public value and transmitted over the wire. And so the attacker is basically just going to collect these along with the messages that they go with. And what they're going to be doing is looking for a collision in nonces. And so when the server repeats a nonce, the attacker is basically just going to execute Jou's attack that we just discussed, and that's going to give them a short list of candidates for the authentication key. Now, in this step, it's important to note that, as I was saying earlier, you might get more than one candidate back. In some of the vulnerable hosts that we saw, this turned out not to be a big problem because they went to repeating the same nonce over and over again. So what we could do is just wait for the next message, repeat the attack again, and eventually we're going to whittle down our list of candidates to just one. At that point, when we have the authentication key, the attacker is going to use his controlled content to redirect the user to a known resource. So that might just be a static web page, or even something like CSS or JavaScript that's served from the target domain. And what the attacker is going to do when he sees the response for that coming back is he's going to tamper with the message and replace it with one of his choosing. So recall that GCM uses stream cipher for the encryption component, basically. So this allows him to tamper with very high precision, basically on a byte-by-byte basis. So as long as the attacker knows what the message is, he can replace it with any message that he wants, essentially. So this is kind of showing I'm not sure if that's too, let me zoom in a bit here. So this is basically the known resource we requested from this vulnerable domain. So actually this domain that we targeted basically just redirects everything to a different domain. It's kind of not really in use anymore, it seems like. So basically the response that we get back is going to be a 301 move permanently. And it has a known piece of HTML. So in theory, we could replace that entire message, but there are some parts that are kind of variable. So there's the date and the expires timestamp. It'd be a little bit tough to be certain that we're placing those correctly. So we chose to go with a more surgical approach where we basically are going to change the HTTP response from 301 to 200 OK, and we're going to kind of mess with the next few headers just to make sure that we don't. Just to make sure it's a valid HTTP response. And then we replace the body of the response with a block of HTML that's basically going to load our slides from a domain we control. So I'd like to show that process one more time. We can kind of talk through it a little bit more. Okay, so this is basically a video of the same kind of attack here. We're going to be attacking the same domain. So you can see here the first couple of messages that come up. It says found nonce, we have a random looking value, and then found nonce, we have this block of zeros. So what's happening here is we're basically just reporting on the responses that are coming back. We're saying these are the nonces that we found here. And we're going to be looking for a collision. And so when we get the next message, you can see that we got the same nonce again. We got another block of zeros. And so that gives us a collision. We go ahead and run the factoring attack to recover some candidates for the key. You can see in this case that we actually have 3 candidates. So we're not sure what to do exactly at this point. So we're just going to wait and collect another message. Then when we get that next message, it's again going to be a block of zeros. And so we again perform the attack. And then that's going to give us some more candidates. But we can just take the intersection of the first set and the second set, and with very high probability, there's just going to be 1 remaining. And so at this point, we have 1 candidate for the key left, and that's going to be the correct value. So we're going to go ahead and inject, and we put this little GIF in there. Yeah, so that's basically our attack on TLS. Looking forward to the future, there are a couple sort of bigger trends that are going to be mitigations against this kind of problem. One is at the protocol level in TLS. So recently, Hanno was saying a new AEAD, Cha-Cha-20 Poly 1305, has gone through the draft process and is being adopted now. So Cha-Cha Poly, instead of this explicit nonce construction, uses the same thing that TLS 1.3 is going to be using in the future, which is instead of transmitting the nonce over the wire, it's kind of baked in to use the sequence number of each record. So any implementation that doesn't conform to that will simply be inoperable. So it'll fail to work, and it'll have to be fixed. And it won't leave room for this kind of implementation error. The second kind of trend is more at the algorithm level. And here we see there have been some moves to define some modes that are resilient against this kind of error in the first place. So you have constructions that generate synthetic initialization vectors or nonces, based on the message itself. And so you can't really get into a situation where repeating the same nonce leads to this kind of problem. The drawback to that kind of scheme is that it requires you to pre-process the entire message before you can proceed. So GCM is, in contrast to that, is what cryptographers would call an online mode, where you can process the message as it comes to you without necessarily knowing how long it is, and kind of stream the ciphertext out to the user. Then do you want to wrap things up?
Okay, yeah, so some conclusions from that. So TLS 1.2, I think it's really an example for a specification that you don't want to have, because it's telling an implementer that, okay, you need a nonce here, but it doesn't give any good guidance on how to do that. And I think we need more robust specs here, where, okay, in many cases we can just avoid these situations by, as Sean just said, in TLS 1.3, the nonce will be an implicit value, so you cannot do that wrong, or else your implementation will just not work. But even if you have a situation like this, then you should at least give very explicit guidance on how to do this. And in this situation, the guidance would just have been, okay, always use a counter, you must use a counter, and everything else is invalid. And kind of the bigger picture here is that I have this saying that whatever you can get wrong in TLS, someone will get wrong. So we have seen implementations, that don't check for the padding, which enable the poodle attack even in versions that were not really vulnerable to it. We have seen implementations that just fail to check the MAC. And we have seen also things like implementations that would check the padding, but only some bytes of it and not all bytes of it. So, and what we're really lacking right now are good test tools. So what I would like to see is that I have a tool that I can run against the server, and it will test all kinds of things that are possible to test on from an outside view without looking into the code. And the most popular thing right now is the SSL Labs test, but it is not as conclusive as one would like it to be. And there's some work done on tools. What I find very promising is a tool called TLS Fuzzer, which is from Hubert Cario from Red Hat. And he's also working on integrating a test for the Nonce issue right now. So that will probably soon support that. But yeah, that's really something that I'd like to see in the future, that we have just much better testing tools. Yeah, and thanks for listening. And we have a GitHub repo where we have published the proof of concept code and also have links to our research paper and all kinds of stuff that's related to this. Also to the advisories from the vendors when there's an update, and we will update this if we learn about more vendors. And then also we now have an online test for this issue, which is a bit rough. I hacked it together yesterday, so if it doesn't work reliably, then please forgive that, and I will try to make it better. But you can just type in a host name there, and it will tell you what nonce values you get and tell you if that's okay. So, yeah, do you have questions? Please speak into the mics so it's in the recording.
Thank you. Very impressive work. One quick question. The key that you try to recover, is that the session key?
So it's actually the sequence number of the TLS record. So TLS itself has a notion of, it's basically like a, each record you ship out has a unique sequence number with it. And it's actually already part of the authenticated data in each message. So it's something that both sides of the connection are already keeping track of. So it makes sense to use it as
so similar to a TCP sequence, but within the TLS session itself.
Yeah.
So TLS has a kind of sequence number for the TLS records, but they are not using exactly the record number, but putting some mask on it, but it's a value derived from the sequence number.
Got it. So there's no need for an explicit nonce to be sent.
Yeah, exactly. And they could have done that. I mean, the TLS 1.2 spec says that you can do that. And if they would have just said you must do that, then this wouldn't have happened.
Understood. Great. Thank you.
Have you looked into to see if any IPsec vendors are doing the GCM correctly? Is your tool, and second, is your tool TLS specific, but could that be ported over to IPsec fairly easily?
So the scan tool or the attack? So the scan tool is TLS specific.
Yeah.
The attack proof of concept is kind of split up into a part that's TLS specific and one that's attacking the lower level, so that could be adapted.
Okay.
But we have not looked at IPsec specifically.
Thanks very much. That was excellent. So you had mentioned that in TLS 1.3 there's a design level mitigation for the nonce misuse problem there.
Yeah.
My question is, if you were designing a new protocol to use GCM or some other AEAD, and you solve just this one problem with GCM, you make sure you don't have this one nonce reuse problem. Is that all there is wrong with GCM, or are there other things you have to watch out for in GCM?
Yeah, so there's actually a lot of problems with GCM. As Hannah was saying from those quotes earlier, a few people just said GCM is extremely fragile, don't use GCM. So yeah, a few different failure modes. So I think Hannah mentioned its software implementations are highly susceptible to cache timing attacks. There was a quote from Niels Ferguson in there that basically said, do not use GCM. And kind of what he was alluding to there was an attack he developed also during the NIST's kind of request for comments, basically, which was basically targeting usages of GCM with a truncated authentication tag. So A lot of times people, maybe not a lot of times, but sometimes people will want to basically truncate the authentication tag, to save bandwidth. So in GCM, the authentication tag is a 128-bit value. So you can see where someone, if they're doing like encrypted voice or something like that, where they're sending tons of small messages, they might want to save some bandwidth by using a small authentication tag, figuring that, it's not really going to matter if the attacker is able to forge, the odd message here and there, as long as most of them are okay. In GCM, this turns out to be a huge problem because when you use a truncated tag, not only are you, reducing your security level the amount you would expect, but the attacker can also reduce it even further based on the size of the message. And every time he's successful in forging a message, he's going to learn a little bit of information about the authentication key. And after a few successful forgeries, he's going to be able to recover it entirely, similar to what we saw here. Yeah, there are other failure modes. It is a, as they said, a fragile construction.
But what most people seem to be worried about are these side channel attacks, and I think it's just that most people right now use this implementation from Emilia Kesper and Peter Schwabe, which has been, I think, well reviewed. And the modern Intel CPUs have an instruction for doing this ghash, which also should be side channel safe. So that's kind of mitigated because everyone's using the safe code base or using the CPU instruction.
Have you considered any of the
Closer to the mic.
have you considered whether there was a problem with supposedly there are some weak keys that in GCM where if you choose a particular session key, then that could result in an H with a small order. Yeah.
So what you're alluding to there is basically, I didn't go into this in too much detail in the talk, but the setting where we're evaluating that polynomial is what's known as a Galois field, and this particular one has a size of 2 to the 128. In a field like this, it's possible for some elements to generate what are called small subgroups, which is to say that they'll only generate a few values if you multiply them by themselves over and over again. This can be a problem in GCM. If you have an extremely weak key, you might be able to swap different blocks, of particular coefficients in the polynomial. I think, as far as I know, that this doesn't seem like a very practical problem to me, and I could be wrong about that. But I think you need to, I think the chances of extremely weak keys are very low, and especially because in TLS the size of each record is capped to a pretty small amount. So I think it's probably not going to be a big issue for TLS or similar protocols.
So the key that you derived that can be used to authenticate arbitrary ciphertext, how do you replace that with your own, because you don't know the session key with which that ciphertext was encrypted? So,
and with the XORing, if you have the authentication key, then the rest of the cipher is like a stream cipher, and then you can if you have a known plaintext basically, which is the website, then you can XOR values on it, and then re-authenticate it with the key you just got.
You have to know in advance what the website is sending you, and then you can
the website is public.
Oh yeah, the HTTP headers, they are common.
Yeah, so it's also worth noting you could go the other way. So our goal was to inject content by replacing a known plaintext. If you were interested in some secret plaintext and you had some kind of error oracle, you could flip bits at random, send them onto the receiver and see what comes back in an effort to try and divulge some of that plaintext. Now, that would probably not be, well, I don't know. I don't know if that would be good for TLS, but
But there's also even another issue that we haven't covered in our research, that if you have two blocks with the same nonce, you can XOR them and get the XORing of the two plaintexts. So if you have one known plaintext, you can use that to decrypt one ciphertext. That's a basic issue of all stream ciphers, that if you use the same key twice, then the XORing of the ciphertext is the XORing of the plaintext.
Thank you for speaking with us. With these avenues of attack in mind, what can we bring to hardware vendors to push them to implement safer mechanisms in hardware, such as the way Intel has added cryptographic support in its processors? What do we need to bring to them to get them to do it right and to understand the importance to hardware enable doing it the right way, so we don't have to keep screwing up in different libraries and different operating platforms?
So one thing, as I said, I would really like to see this test tool where I could tell a hardware vendor, please, does your device, if I run this test tool against your device, does it show any errors? And if yes, why don't you fix them? And I mean, yeah, the other thing is, and the question is if you want to fix GCM in a way that you have side channel safe and hardware instructions, or if you just want to move on to other ciphers. That you could also ask them that they should support SHA-20.
Did you investigate what the failure mode in the implementations that were repeating nonces? Was this just because they memset the nonce to 1, 2, 3, 4? Was it a randomness failure? Were they always using 0? And if so, did your scanning methodology for identifying the hosts that were repeating nonces account for the fact that you may need different approaches to detect different failure modes? For example, you might need a lot more requests for a randomness failure versus a memset.
So we didn't find any vulnerable implementation where we had access to the code, or even access to the software. So we could not look deeper into this. I mean, I said with this OpenSSL thing where I have kind of the assumption that this might be the cause. But for the attack, it doesn't make a big difference because you're just looking for a duplicate nonce, and that's like always the same approach. But the ones, like the example we were attacking here, that was just sending a random value and then just always a 0. So, yeah. But I don't know what the flaw in the code here is because I don't have access to the software.
You had a slide where you take the server's ciphertext, you XOR the server's plaintext, and then you XOR it again with your plaintext. Are there any limitations on the length of the plaintext that you want to inject in your man-in-the-middle attack?
Yeah, that's a great question, actually. So I said earlier that basically we can replace a known resource with an arbitrary message of our choosing, but that's not quite true because we're in some sense limited to the length of the message we're replacing because we need to get we basically use our knowledge of that plaintext to recover the key stream and make our new ciphertext. So while we could extend past the end of that message, we would kind of be taking shots in the dark at that point, and it's probably not going to be advantageous for us as the attacker. So that's actually why we went the route we did, which was basically just injecting a small amount of HTML that loaded more from elsewhere.
But in the web setting, that's not really an issue because as soon as you can inject your own JavaScript code, you have one. You can do whatever you want. Yeah. Okay.
Okay, I guess if there are no more questions, thanks for coming out.